And this position of executive in charge of production was a job that existed because every studio in those days, in 1939, MGM released a major motion picture each week. 52 of them. And they were not the only outfit doing that or very close to that. All the big studios released a lot of films. So they had film crews that were under contract, paid all year long to be there and to work. And each film crew had a producer that was under contract to the studio. And then my dad would have so many films that were shooting, 3 to 5 films usually, and he would be in charge of the producers and making sure the producers were spending the money correctly, making sure the film was being made correctly, and keeping the studio, keeping Mr. Zanuck happy in particular. And that was his career. And he became an expert in large-scale production and worked on and was executive in charge of production for some of the largest movies ever made in the history of the movies through the 50s and 60s. And then he retired in 1968 after he did Cleopatra. His younger brother was my Uncle Bob. Robert L. Surtees was actually how he took his credit. 6 years younger than my dad. And Bob was, he was an artist and interested in art. And he went to art school in Cincinnati, Ohio. And he came out of there and worked as a still photographer and retouched stills. And he did that for a while, a number of years actually. And my grandfather finally went to him and said, "Bob, you're not making any money doing this. You love photography. They shoot these movies. They have cameramen. Why don't you come out and I'll get you a job as an assistant beginning cameraman." So Bob came out here in 1927, and my grandfather got him on at Universal. And at Universal, he worked for this guy, Joseph Rutherford, who at the time was one of the top DPs, one of the top directors of photography. Let's talk about director of photography for a second. The director of photography is the guy on the set whose primary responsibility is the quality of the image. What your shooting looks like, and all of the components that go into that. And so it involves what cameras you're using, what lenses you're using. It involves the backgrounds and balancing the color of the film, balancing the light and dark of the film, all those type of responsibilities. And so Bob went to work as a third assistant cameraman, and I know they have it down here somewhere. By the way, 73 credits, you'll never see that again. That's a lot of movies to be a director of photography on, 73. So in those days, you really had to be an apprentice in the motion picture business. And you had to work your way up from third assistant to second assistant to first assistant. First assistant was the guy who gets to load the camera and changes the lenses. He's pretty much in charge of the camera. To camera operator, the cameraman who is actually operating the camera. To director of photography, the guy who's in charge of the photographic crew and of capturing the image of the film. And the director of photography's job is a combination of technical. He's got to know all the lenses, all the cameras, all the camera stocks, all the filters, all the lighting equipment. And the second part of it is lighting. And that's the most important part. And to a cinematographer, that's the artistic part. Cinematographers basically paint with light. That's the definition of the artistic definition of their artistic function. They basically paint with light. And when you go to a movie, whether you notice it or don't notice it, your eye is often being directed by the lighting of the scene. By the lighting emphasizing where it wants your eye to go. And so you have not only the technical part of that, you have the artistic part, which is that lighting has to help set the mood of the scene and the style, the visual style of the film, the visual style the directors picked for the film to be. And that all falls on the shoulders of the director at the time. So Bob gets to Universal and he goes to work for Joe Ruttenberg, who's one of the best guys ever. And he starts out, he's an assistant cameraman, and finally gets to be a camera operator 8 years later. And some of these movies, by the way, were very famous movies at the time they were made. Sacramouche, Top of the Town, Captain Blood, A Midsummer's Night's Dream. They were all big movies at the time. Some of them predate the Oscars. And then he spent a couple years in Berlin before he went to MGM. And then he comes back and he goes to MGM. He goes through this process that kind of no longer exists. I mean, you still have to start as a second assistant cameraman. You actually start as a permanent cameraman until you get so many days or hours, and then they move you to second assistant. But they go through it pretty fast these days. You'll see this when we talk about My Cousin. And so he goes to work and he starts shooting these films. Los Angeles, a very famous film. And 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, he wins the Academy Award. It would be his first Academy Award. He would have 16 nominations. He would have 3 wins. And his last Academy Award would be 33 years later. So that's a long and very active and very high-achieving career. In the pantheon of cameramen, the ASC, which is the American Society of Cinematographers. If you're a real good director of photography, you get invited to join the American Society of Cinematographers. And all the best cameramen end up in there. And a few years ago, they did a voting among their members, many of whom, know the history of photography, cinematography very well. My friend Alan Davio is an Academy Award-winning cinematographer. It's like a walking encyclopedia. It's amazing the stuff he does. And so anyway, they sent out this ballot and they decided to choose the 100 greatest cameramen of all time. And the top 5 guys, number 1 was Billy Bitzer. Billy Bitzer was D.W. Griffith's cameraman. D.W. Griffith was the first great filmmaker in the American film business. And he was the first studio filmmaker to do big, spectacular movies. He did a film that, if you look at it now, it's actually very racist, called Birth of a Nation. And it was a huge, huge, huge hit at the time. And Billy was his cameraman. And the DPs, the ASC guys voted Billy number 1 on that list because Billy had the fewest tools to work with, and he had the most primitive equipment. And yet he had astounding images, incredible images. And these were all silent film images. Number 2 on that list was a man named James Wong Howe. He was a Chinese guy who was originally born in San Francisco, California. And he worked from the silence all the way through into the 1970s. And he has the most Oscar nominations of any director of photography. And even in the 70s, he shot HUD for Paul Newman in the 70s. Incredible movie, the look of that movie. And he was a very well-known, well-respected, much awarded cameraman. Third on that list, was this guy, Greg Tolan. And Bob had worked for Greg Tolan during those years between Universal and before he started at MGM, and then later at MGM because Greg Tolan became the first cameraman, the top DP for their top crew. Greg Tolan's most famous for shooting Citizen Kane for Orson Welles. But in addition to Citizen Kane, which is an amazing job as a cinematographer, if you go to see that movie, it's based on the life of William Randolph Hearst, who built Hearst Castle. And it's shot in these tremendous, huge sets. And what Toland did that was different was he kept everything in focus, from the guy standing right in the forefront of the frame all the way to the art on the back wall. And it's hard to do that without just, you can do it by just flooding the place with light, but then it's just going to white out and be all flat. You have to model the light and have the proper amount of light all the way back to be able to do that. And Toland did it. He was the first person to do a film that way, and it made him famous. Early in his career, he almost instantaneously, once he was a director of photography, became very in demand and very famous because directors and producers liked the way his movies looked. He'd come from an art background, and he used light in very artistic ways. And he was always trying to get the most artistic framing and the most artistic content into that frame. I was telling Ed, one of the ways he worked was he'd go through the script with the director, and they'd talk about the overall style, how the director wanted the film to look. Did he want real saturated colors? Did he want real highlighty kind of look? Did he want a real flat look? Did he want a real dark look? What did he want? What was the overall style he wanted for the film? And then they'd go through it scene by scene, shot by shot, off the director's storyboard. And then Bob would take this stuff home, and he'd go to all these fine, he had a library full of these fine art books with all these recreations of all these famous paintings in the history of art. And he'd go there, and he'd match what they wanted. He'd find a picture by a famous artist, could have been a contemporary artist, all the way back to, you know, Leonardo da Vinci. Didn't make any difference to him. He'd find the one that matched it. And he'd look at the lighting, how the artist used lighting in that painting. And he'd go to the studio and recreate it for that shot. He'd recreate that kind of lighting. So he was always drawing from the masters. And he did it right from the beginning, and right from the beginning, people said, oh man, look at this picture, look at this shot, and it was the artistic content and the way the lighting matched the mood and motif of the shot, the scene, and the style of the film. So that was the first thing that got him on that list. The second thing that got him on that list, all the studios were in trouble in the early to mid-50s. And so they decided what they were going to do, kind of what they do today, is they were going to make these spectacular movies that were so big and so incredible that people would leave their television sets, come out to the theater, and pay to see it. And so Bob was right at the point where all that was happening. Down here, by the way, he won the Academy Award for The Bad and the Beautiful, which is black and white, very moody-looking picture. And every studio had their own version of this wide-angle look, and they were going from the old 35mm film, like you use a 35mm still camera. It's all digital now, so you guys have probably never seen 35mm film. You can still buy it, but it's a rare item. I'm going to go down here again because I'm going to... Around the World in 80 Days, 1956, Todd A.O. It's one of the first films shot in a wide-angle process. It was shot by the producer Mike Todd, a very famous guy. My dad was the executive in charge of production for it. My uncle was the, they say, advisor of Todd A.O. Prices. He was actually an advisor to Technicolor because they were taking the film from 35mm and making the film 65mm to give the cinematographer a wider but a little more narrower frame to shoot in. Okay? And so Bob was involved with the very beginning of that. And then he comes up here to MGM, where he is now MGM's first cameraman. He is the director of photography for MGM's best shooting unit. It gets put with all the best directors. And he starts doing these wide-angle films.